Good afternoon and most welcome to H908. We are filming here in the lovely city garden of Gothenburg, and it's a most enticing spring day. And I also feel now, although it's clouded, warmth has come to Gothenburg. If we get one or two more of these days, spring is going to be premature here in Gothenburg. Usually it doesn't catch on until somewhere in the vicinity of the end of April or early May. But with this warmth, and if we're lucky enough there is no more frost nights, we can be in clearance for an early spring, and that is good news. I will today talk about a little bit more about David Barder. I want to put what we've been talking about into a very recent neurological discovery, and that has to do with the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the thing in our brain that controls thinking. Previously we didn't understand that there was an agent in our brain that controlled the thinking and made it balanced. And I think actually this rings together with Derrida and his conception of meaning, because our current conception of meaning, talking, intention, extension, we know doesn't do the trick at all, doesn't work. So how does meaning, thinking, talking works? Well, the theory of David Barder is that we've neglected too much the cerebellum. It had seemed too long to be unimportant, and it even acquired the name in Swedish, the little brain. And it seemed to be less complicated than, for instance, the cortex of our head, which is very fractal, and one can visually see that it's very complicated. But the cerebellum seemed to be on top. So what is the quality in cerebellum will also define the thinking quality, and that means that everything else is dependent on the act of the cerebellum. Before these neurological discoveries, we have known that the cerebellum was responsible for our movement. So a good functioning of the cerebellum meant precise, smooth and flexible movement. It also meant that you were less stiff in your joints, and most good physicians and good sportsmen have a perfectly working cerebellum. That's an absolute necessity for grandiose movement. Interestingly enough, it turned out the very same movement in the cerebellum, you can spot that on an MRI or an EEC. That same movement is also a good thinking movement. And without a good functioning cerebellum or a trained cerebellum, our thinking, our thoughts will be less in quality. So there is an absolute correlation between what the cerebellum can do and how we work. When it comes to something called emotional dystonia means that we are not able to regulate our emotions. It's also called emotional dysregulation. This comes in a wide variety of levels, but I think it could be really fair to say that being in the midst of analytical philosophy is a case of some sort of emotional dysregulation. Why is that? Well, the reason is that your subjective want for something takes over the understanding for reality. And that is caused by a lack in your own system. A lack in the system is always, without an exception, some sort of emotional dysregulation, because it's in with the emotions we have the lack. In order to sort of when we come to emotional dysregulation, what we find there is a two regular sort of motion. It is almost like the fibrillation of a diseased heart. And the reason for that is that we don't have the cerebellum under control. It is doing its own things. And that means that it's sending out thoughts where there should be no thoughts, and it is also not sending thoughts when thoughts should come. And that, once more, is very typical for the metaphysics of presence. You don't know yourself what you are doing. There is a sort of a blank area which makes you want to go into the presence, and thereby losing even more of the presence you had. It's incredibly close to what is emotional dysregulation. And all the sort of counter actions that the person are taking are very similar to Tartaglia going for the objects. They are going into the self-constructed world. The deceased cerebellum constructs the world by itself, by sending out the signals without interacting with the radically difference. And that means that we go in further and further into our own system. The creation in the object that we self-create, this is where we look for presence and existence. Obviously something incredibly big has happened in Gothenburg. That was at least the 15th or 16th police car, ambulance / fire car. So what's going on, I don't know. I hope it is nothing serious, too serious. But sorry about that sound disturbance. The only way of getting into the cerebellum and trying to disrupt its regular signal, it is by some sort of intervention. And I think this is the point where repetition comes in. This could be the very reason when one took away the repetition of the liturgy in the monasteries all over the world in the mid-60s, I think it was, in this concilium of the Vatican. An absolute disaster happened in the monasteries. There were mental diseases, people even committed suicide, they fell into depression, and it was a huge loss for faith that actually even today hasn't been recovered. I think this incessant repetition was an aid in controlling the too regular activity of the cerebellum, because incessant careful repetition does just that. It is a sort of a defibrillator for the cerebellum. It calibrates it in a new and higher chaotic system. And since all chaotic systems are stable, what could happen when you cease to train the cerebellum is either, if it's stable enough, you can take in other things that can continue its stability, that your spiritual development can continue and go forward. But a sudden taking away of the training at the wrong point can lead that you go back to where you were before. It sort of crashes the system. It needs this incessant influx of repetition to work in a good manner. And it seems also taking in too much of this objectified, self-created world. This is what goes for the sameness in the sinus curve of the cerebellum. It takes us away from the closed loop. And here we have a much deeper understanding why liturgy was so big. And please remember, do not forget, liturgy still to this day is very important in many traditions, especially China, Japan, Korea, Thailand and so forth. It takes a predominant role. It is deemed to be the most important of it all. And also other repetitions, especially if they are complicated, do the same thing, as in remembering the very complicated and not regular Chinese signs. There is no chance of any simplification when it comes to those. They are in themselves actually some sort of radical difference. And the many meanings of them will help to shy away from the regulation of the sinus curve in the cerebellum. Oddly enough, this that sounds like a disturbance to the brain does just the opposite. The stimulation is actually calming the rest of the thinking process, where we have here in the prefrontal cortex. It makes thinking clearer as well, and it makes it more possible to dwell into memory banks that doesn't become accessible because of the regular sinus curve. The regularity doesn't adjust to the specific situations. It's a little bit like those machines that water grass carpets. It waters in the same regular moment, but if there are some spots that needs more water, it won't do that. There's no regulation. It gives water equal in every spot. And that is for the thinking process a disaster. We don't want the thinking to be repetitive and same, because we have to adjust for each individual, specific and unique situation. And when I read this, I started directly to think about the modern thinking system, the educational system, how intelligentsia is today. It is just pure repetition, nothing but tedious repetition again and again and again. So oddly enough, from the training with repetition comes out things that are very far from repetition. But looking for the other makes you the same. This is very odd, but once more, here we have the paradoxical nature of reality. It is not that simple as we usually think. Another interesting manner is that we discovered in the Eastern countries, this is something that is more or less within the gestalt of these people. They don't have the proxy of the ontic mode. And the ontic mode, as we explained before, it's a sort of direct self-reflection. Once you navigate into that mood, the risk of coming into this whirlwind or zigzag pattern that leads down is much less. And they train themselves towards reality, not a fixed point somewhere, and almost being tricked into self-construct reality instead of being in reality. So in a way, this training is not explicitly mentioned, not in the Vedas, neither in the Upanishad. You don't find it in the Tao Te Ching. It's already in the substratum. It's non-verbal, and it is always happening because there is nothing to lead them away from reality. They don't have the, so to speak, proxy idea of an alternative reality within ourselves. So one could say, in a way, not in all ways, but in a way they are vaccinated against this effect. And I think that also shows the reason why all Eastern philosophies, religions and so forth, always gets sort of taken experientially the wrong way. They show that there is no soul, there is no free will, and there is no God, when it's exactly the opposite that is the case. And I think that is very interesting, especially when it comes to the case of Schopenhauer, one of my favorite misinterpreter of the East. He thinks it's all about some sort of vile depression and giving everything up. And by giving everything up, you don't have any needs. That doesn't work. It's just a horrible solution. Instead, what the East is teaching us is that we can control our thinking and thereby coming more into reality. More into reality. And with this knowledge, the disaster of the 60s could have been avoided, because now we're getting closer to understand the incredibly beneficial character of this concentration, repetition, focusing. It's also important that it's done parallel with movement or other doings. And that was also the case within the monasteries. They repeated as they walked, they repeated as they did their chores. Maybe one small remnant of that is the rosario you have in your hand, where for each one you do Pater Noster and for the other a Hail Mary. This could in some primitive way do the trick, but it needs to be more complicated. You need to sort of become a mat all over consciousness for a while, and then you go back to your regular thinking, and that will also help you in the motivational stage. You will notice the difference in the calmness and in the sharper mind. And something I discovered by doing this, I've been doing it for almost 3 years now. I have constantly a verse with 33 different lines or paragraphs coming from Edward de Bono, and as I speak now I am repeating them to myself, and to this I added the Yang form of Tai Chi, which I learned by heart many years ago, well, 3 years ago I think, and I'm doing that at the same time, and that seemed to keep my sharpness when I do my lectures nowadays. I don't get that tired, and I can also take in the environment, because I have a constant reminder that awareness is constantly possible. But one important starting thing, and that is repeated so often in Barder's book, and that is there is no other way of controlling the thinking and the body. We need to start with the cerebellum. An outer method cannot work, because cerebellum is the deciding factor. It is oddly enough not the thinking factor. So confusing thinking with your consciousness is one of those problematic tropes. The one that was shared by, well, I had it myself for a long time, but also René Descartes. He thought that his thinking was his soul. We need the soul. That's actually the message from some of the neurologists, Jeremy Schwartz being one. I can't say he defends this view very good outside neurology. He tries to defend it actually within Catholicism. It's very interesting. I don't think he does do such a good job there, but it's still interesting because he has a point. I think he's right. But when it comes within neurology, it is very clear that we need this other agent. And this agent is, oddly enough, cannot be corporal. And that can actually sort of be proven. I don't like those proof of the soul. The soul is too self-evident. It doesn't need any proof. And actually proof can just undermine the absolute obvious of the soul. Because when you encounter it yourself, you see it's such a determining factor in the quality of your thinking. Something that you need to sort of pay more attention to. How it changes during the day and how awareness is coming and going. And for me, this coming and going awareness is almost like an ebb and tide. And it's flowing and coming during the day, but also within each moment. And this actually reminds me quite a bit about the deconstruction of the expression from Aristotle by Derrida, because there is a flow there too. Sometimes the weight is lying on the first part of the line, and sometimes it's lying on the second line, and sometimes both. Sometimes it is lying on the last line. It becomes especially emphasized, there are no friends, and thereby either meaning for the ones listening or to myself, there are no friends, but it can also mean the absolute opposite. Something that shows that the paradoxical nature is also the meaning-giving nature, the one that makes a possibility to reach beyond where we are currently and getting a bit further. I think this is a sort of a seed to a new method. And
yes, so to resume cerebellum. So cerebellum, so to say, proves that we need repetition. That's the point from neurolinguistics. Did I understand?
Yeah, yeah, and I think this could go even further, so we can sort of establish a method, and this method could help those afflicted by things like lack of focus, this emotional dysregulation I mentioned, which is, I'm afraid, not that uncommon these days. I would even think, and this is way too far-fetched, but I see potentiality even to help those poor people who are suffering from dyslexia uncommon, because dyslexia is also a thinking fault. It's thinking in the wrong order. It doesn't start with the actual reading process. The fault is already established within thinking. They think wrongly. They don't even have to have a text in front of them to do that mistake. And I think by sort of combining the realization we get from deconstruction, this very promising new from Tartan Tulku, with a neurologically established method, which actually we already started with. The slow movement is also something that helps the cerebellum. That was the point from Ken Ware and he has a lot of study results there. It's much better with scientific evidence than actually philosophizing about his discoveries. But I'm more willing to do that. That's more or less my profession. So stretching out the arms to Ken Ware will be very interesting, because he might need an ideological support as well. The case with Ken Ware, he has the eyes on him from all over the world. But yes, scientific evidence is there as well, but it needs some sort of ideological structure, and an ideological structure that can combine it with what we experience in the world. Ken Ware, excuse me the pun, is widely aware that this problem has been more prolific the last couple of decades. And that explanation we could give, because it's this high domination of an education that lies on presence existence, shutting out things, teaching students that shut out awareness, both in the, so to speak, ontological world, the thinking world, and the outside world is the best way to have knowledge. That is sending everything into the wrong direction. And this could also help the fantastic and glorious mission of Edward de Bono, because his book is nothing short but marvelous, but it needs another format to actually enter. And what will be better than to put this into method to help those people? And since there is already a very nice connection here with the cerebellum and our movement, we know that lack of coordination and flexibility and awareness in our movement is exactly what leads to repetitive strain injury, and also such problems as asthma and allergy, because it puts a strain on the immune system. When you start working against yourself, not understanding the rhythm of the body, you are already attacking yourself. And having all these environmental stimuli will add to the fact, but that is not the only attractor, so to speak. And oddly enough, this path I chose in this lecture, which I think is a very fruitful one, speaking about single attractors and higher and lower systems of chaos. Because what we have now with a person who is, for instance, suffering from lack of focus, he is on the lowest scale of a chaos system. And the hard thing why it never gets shifted is that once it's settled on that level, it will not go to the higher level. It becomes a customary. That is why, for instance, if my heart now, God forbid, goes into the sinus wave, we need to stop that heart. There is no other way. It needs to be stopped. So we don't have any gentle method of letting people who are suffering from ADHD, which I would think is a causal chaotic organizational system, where that person gets used of solving everything in sort of a half good way. Once it's used, it will feed into itself, and there doesn't seem to be any solution. And adding on top of this, going to the higher level will cause destabilization. Every time you go from one chaotic system to a higher one, in between will be a destabilization. The same happens if you start the heart again. You will go into the shakes. It's actually almost like an epileptic seizure. The same will happen with our thinking system once we pass to the higher system. And that is frightening. It could also be disrupting the thinking even more. But it is passing. And don't you see, this is very interesting. This is one of the reasons people never ever get out of the focusing problems. Once you are there, it stabilizes. And once you get out of the stability, you get instability. This happened in every case that Ken Ware treated. Not a single case. In every singular case he treated, instability occurred. So he needed to be with that person to encourage him to struggle on, despite the fact the whole person was shaking, looking like they had like some strange attack. But what happens in the end? The person stops shaking and he gets into a higher mood, and all of a sudden a person who has not been able to walk before can walk. This is the reason Ken Ware had gotten attention from all over the world. People are even making pilgrimage to his place in Australia, which is far away. But when I went into the internet to have a look-see, there were articles from all over the world. New York Times, London Times, you mention it, scientific journals, 60 Minutes been there, CNS has been there, CNN has been there, everyone has been there. He has a lot of attention. But I think he would need this ideology to really show why we need this so much, because this is a much needed thing. And he also made me understand, once people are in this lack of focus, they are stuck for good. No longer. There is a change, because Ken Ware actually help people who've been paraglectic for 2 decades start to walk again. We're speaking about nothing less than a miracle. It's been doctors who just written off his method as miraculous, saying this is just not possible, it's a miracle. And you usually don't hear stern atheist physicians say that, but it's been said. And people who try treatment for 20 years and where the neurological center for movement is gone, absolutely gone, and they can still move. Why is that? Why is that? It is because movement is a chaotic regular system. It is not constructed in our body-mind system only. It's a higher organization. And now you also see why the regulation of the cerebellum is so complicated and paradoxical, because it's a chaotic system. It is not a normal system. And all normal treatment is thereby completely invalid. They will not work from the onset because it does not work in a consistent, non-paradoxical manner. Our body-mind system, or the higher system, is in itself a system that takes an active ingredient, and that is in the form of something that is radically different. And if that radical difference is not there, the chaotic organizing principle will not be so strong. And if it can make paraglectic walk again, although the motion center is gone, it could make ordinary people like me and you or whoever is listening be more balanced, both in thinking, spiritual manner, and in bodily manner. This is a way to healthiness. This is a way to a super health. This is a word Ken Ware. I'm not so happy with that. I would call it resilience. That is the understanding that for every time you put your system into the peril, almost to the peril of collapsing, it will get stronger. If you have the regulative repetitive movement, both in your body and in your cerebellum. Otherwise, nothing will happen. But if you do those things at the same time, in adjusted, not too fringe, like don't push it too much. It's another important rule. It should be in good measure. How do you say in Latin? Quantum satis. That is very important. So it needs to be under observance. But it shows that you can conquer things like horrible phobias and this OCD that is becoming so common, where people become obsessed by washing their hands. And oddly enough, although it seems so easy to tell a person or tell oneself, I shouldn't wash my hands 30, 40 times a day, it is impossible to resist, even with the greatest will of all. It needs something more. It needs a combined regulation of the cerebellum via the method I just proposed here, together with the body movement that is helpful. And then you will be able to conquer most things. I don't think there is a limit to this. I think this is a good stopping point at anyone, I say. Thank you very much for your patience listening, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.